Let's move back to the Mississippi, and let's ask Gerald Galloway Professor Galloway to take us through what went wrong and lessons learned. And I'm grateful for him doing this in advance of General Van Antwerp's presentation because of the scheduling of generals. Professor Galloway.
I need to pull up my slides, if you would.
Where's the Bishop of London? Richard, are you hiding somewhere? There was a question of when one might find opportunities for prayer. And it occurs to me as I sit through endless presentations where the technology doesn't quite work,
yes,
that rather than feeling embarrassment, we should regard that as an invitation for prayer at that moment. Anyway, with the prayer that this all works, you have the floor, sir.
Well, thank you all very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm sort of the in-between. Yesterday you heard from General Walsh of the Corps of Engineers, and you're going to hear shortly from General Van Antwerp, who is the head of the Corps of Engineers nationwide. I was asked to come in and sort of fill in the blanks. Now, in Truth in Lending, I am a retired Corps of Engineer officer, and so I have some interest in what's going on here. I spent 7 years on the Mississippi River Commission. I'm currently working for the governor of Louisiana on the Coastal Protection and Restoration Commission. But what I was asked to do was talk about Katrina for a few minutes to put in setting what General Walsh and General Van Antwerp are going to say and what you're seeing around you. Everybody recognizes this picture. We happen to be in one of the few parts of downtown New Orleans that wasn't underwater. You can see the Superdome. We're here on the right-hand side, closer to the river, where the natural levee exists. Katrina happened, and the question then becomes one of, as we move forward, what happened? You see scenes like this, which represents a flood wall that failed and let water into the city. Several flood walls failed. And the question that arises is, why did this happen? For those of you who have not had a chance to get over there, that's the lower 9th Ward, which is an icon for social equity in this particular case. And you're seeing water coming out of the lower 9th Ward back into something called the Industrial Canal. It had been completely filled as a flood wall, which is now on the ground underneath about 15 feet of water, fell over, let all that water rush in, and then as the sea level went down after the hurricane, it began to drain naturally out. But why did all of this happen? That's really the question. So I would like to share with you what happened and why, and what can we do about it, or what should we be doing about it. And I'm not going to give you my opinion, because that's coming this afternoon when I talk about how do we deal with this in the future? How do you deal with habitation in dangerous areas? First of all, let me tell you that you're looking at the Mississippi River, obviously. That's the purple line that goes through the middle of this particular chart. We're sitting in the general area of the bend in the river, one of the bends in the river. And what's important to note is that nobody worried about hurricanes up until 1965. Before then, from 1717 on, when Bienville settled here in New Orleans, the issue was that mighty Mississippi coming over the top of the city and flooding everyone. And since 1927, when a disastrous flood occurred in the valley, and you heard this from John Barry, the Corps of Engineers has been responsible for control of the flows of the Mississippi River and the levees that we are literally on top of as we speak, and that you saw yesterday, to protect the city from the flow of the Mississippi. Now, why is that so important? Imagine that there were 1 million cubic feet per second of water coming by in the river when it's high, and you had a flood, and you had a levee break. That would continue for 2 or 3 weeks, whereas a hurricane comes in and within 24 hours, it's done its damage and moved on. So the worry has always been the Mississippi River, and that levee has performed magnificently since 1927. The other part of this is, when the Mississippi is in flood, there are 3 million cubic feet per second coming down the river. Only 1 million can be successfully passed by New Orleans, a little over 1 million. And so what do? There are 3 areas north of here, between here and above Baton Rouge, where they divert water into the Atchafalaya Basin or into Lake Pontchartrain and then to the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a very complex system to deal with the Mississippi itself. But that's not what Katrina was about. Katrina was about hurricane protection, which are the lines you see around the outside. In 1965, a devastating storm hit this particular part of the country, and it became obvious that the back door to New Orleans was the storm surges out of the Gulf of Mexico that were coming into the city and that would push water in. So they started to build a hurricane protection system. How did they do this? After Katrina, everybody was very concerned about how could we let a disaster like this happen in the United States. And so the Department of the Defense said, what we want to do is form a forensic examination team to see what went wrong. And that was called the Interagency Performance Evaluation Task Force. It was made up of the Corps of Engineer personnel, personnel from other federal agencies, and from academia and business. And abroad, we had people from the Netherlands and from Japan working very closely with the team. But to ensure that what they were doing made technical sense, the Department of Defense asked the American Society of Civil Engineers to have an expert review panel called the External Review Panel that would examine step by step as they went through this 3-year process to determine what went wrong. They would examine what was happening. There would be public fora throughout this process, and then all of this would be taken to our National Academy, where an independent review panel would examine what the American Society of Civil Engineers had said, what the basic report, what's called the IPET report, said, and they would then give their view of, was the report adequate, did it properly reflect what went on, and then what should be done. At the same time, the Corps of Engineers commissioned a hurricane protection decision chronology. In 1965, they started thinking about building a hurricane protection here, and yet in 2005, it wasn't finished. How did that happen, and what was the chronology of events? Then there were other studies going on. Dr. Ivar Van Heerden, who will be here this afternoon, was part of another study that looked at the issues. All this information was taken into account by the National Research Council, the National Academy, which is there to synthesize the fact. These had to do with why did things fail in terms of a structural system. Another issue was why didn't the city respond? And I'm not going to speak a lot about it, but I will note that both the United States Senate and the White House looked at the U.S. response, and I'll give you one quote from the White House report at the end. What was Katrina? It was the highest storm surge ever measured in the United States. This is a picture of that storm surge going over the levees on the east side of town. 80% of New Orleans was flooded as a result. This is the area of New Orleans that were flooded. The pink and blue areas are the areas that went underwater, and the depths range from a few feet here in near the French Quarter to 15 to 20 feet in some other areas. Devastating impact on the city. There were breaches of levees in several places, as shown here, on outlet canals that take water from the center city. This is a bowl. We're actually on the edge of the bowl right here, but it goes downhill from us as you go into the city, comes downhill from Lake Pontchartrain, and it's a bowl that fills with water when there's heavy rainfall. So the city has to have a massive pumping system to pump the water out into the Lake Pontchartrain. And there are channels to get that water out into Lake Pontchartrain with walls along the side, the slide you saw earlier, and several of those failed during the process of the hurricane. We are actually at that red star at the bend in the river. What were the consequences of Katrina? Just to remind you, there were more than 1,300 fatalities. For the United States, that's an enormous loss of life. As we all recognize in coastal areas around the world, that happens on an annual basis, and that figures of 10 or 20,000 are not unusual. 70% of those, and I'm concerned about this, were over the age of 70. We, like the British Foresight report discovered, have many people that are vulnerable, and they tend to be the elderly, the disadvantaged, and the economically deprived. The same thing happened here in New Orleans. One of the challenges was you can't expect a 70-year-old person to climb into the attic and with an axe cut a hole through the roof so they can get on top of the house to survive water that's rising. The property losses were direct $20 billion, but there were $7 billion beyond that in terms of the infrastructure, and the many others, when you take them together, make the cost of the hurricane and its restoration over $100 billion. But more important than all of that, perhaps, was the breakdown in the social structure of the city. People left this city. There was nowhere to go. When you have a flood in many areas, you move 3 miles or 5 miles to high ground. Here, the high ground is 45 miles. So you have people that had to leave the area, go as far away as Oregon and Minnesota to find a place to live. And many of these people have not returned. And then we saw severe damage to the cultural heritage and the physical, economic, and political structure of this particular area. Well, what went wrong? This is the result of the IPET report. There was the system around here, the hurricane protection system is 352 miles of levee. It didn't perform as a system. It was designed initially in the late 60s and early 70s, and work began. Nobody changed those over time for a variety of reasons. It was never completed, and so it was not a comprehensive hurricane protection system. There is datum by which you can find geodetic information, and the datum changed from time to time, and the levels of the protection were not seen to be different, even though the datum pointed out that what you thought should have provided 3 feet of protection now only provided 1.5 feet of protection. And so it reduced the intended level of protection. And nobody put the pump systems that clean out the inside of the city into the overall hurricane protection system, so they weren't built as a package. Levees failed or overtopped. Now that's a significant engineering challenge, and I'm sure General Van Antwerp's going to address that. 4 levees had fundamental failures in design, and those levees and flood walls on the canals primarily were the challenges that flooded about 60% of the damage that occurred. Beyond that, 46 levees overtopped. Now there's a difference when you design a levee to protect against water that's going to be this high, and the water is this high. The levee did its job, you just didn't build it high enough to protect the city. And that's not considered a failure, it's an overtopping. But when it overtopped, because resilience was not built into the levee system, they quickly eroded and created the 46 levee breaches that I show here. The conclusions of the National Academy were stunning. They followed the conclusions of the IPET and the American Society of Civil Engineers, but they're worth pointing out. Hydrologic reality. The risks of inundation can't be eliminated. And this is the hardest thing that has come out of Katrina for people to understand. Because if you would talk to most people in New Orleans, they believe because there was a levee, because there was a flood wall, they were protected. One led to the other. The Academy says, no, that's not the case. And no matter how large or sturdy they are, they can be damaged, overtopped, or failed. Protective structures, there was undue optimism that the structures you had would work exactly as you expected them to work. Structural measures shouldn't be the only way you deal with flooding. There has to be use of non-structural measures, such as elevating the homes, not letting people move into areas that are at extreme risk, doing such things as taking care of the home to prevent water coming in it, even if you don't elevate it. Many things can be done, and they point out that protective structures shouldn't be the only answer. The third thing they said was relocations and flood-proofing should be a major part of the strategy of people looking at the future of the New Orleans and coastal Louisiana. Something needs to be done and should be considered a viable public option. Unfortunately, many people don't see it this way, and as a result, tend to want to go right back where they were, even though that might be in the most dangerous part of the city. There are challenges with this that have to be addressed, and the Academy suggested things that could be done. The second conclusion set was evacuation. The city was not able to get people out. It was an enormous evacuation. It was highly successful in the sense that a large percentage of the population left. But those that didn't have cars, those that weren't able to move from their homes, go to central points, didn't get out. And what they're pointing out that there is a need for a focus on evacuation to make evacuation less imposing and to ensure that you can actually get out, that all the roads that you're using for evacuation will be available. The risk communication and education is something that not only is a worry here in New Orleans, but around the country. People do not understand the risks that they face. And the challenge is, how do you communicate this risk? So far, we have been unable across the nation to adequately do this. There's a couple of things that have started here in New Orleans that enable a better understanding or appreciation by the locals of what is actually happening. but it is still ingrained that the memory of a flood quickly fades and that people think it will never happen again. Now, New Orleans is a special case, and people can still see in the lower Ninth Ward and other areas the destruction. But in most places, and in parts of New Orleans, people have already begun to forget the problem. The third conclusion, third set of conclusions, and perhaps the most important is one that we'll talk about this afternoon a little bit, is New Orleans is now being restored, the protection for New Orleans, to something called the 100-year level. The 100-year flood is that flood which has a 1% chance of occurrence in any given year, or if you're thinking in terms of mortgages, there's a 1 in 4 chance that the 100-year flood will occur in the life of a 30-year mortgage. Not very good odds. The 100-year level of protection is being used. The Academy said that's not the right answer. That's too little for a major urban area. We've got to do better than that. And as I'll point out this afternoon, in the Netherlands, along the rivers, their standard of protection is between 1,250 and 2,000-year protection, and on the coast, 10,000-year protection. And contrast that with the 100 years. And basically, their line is the standard is inadequate. We should not do this. Now, there are some things that are being talked about for the future. General Van Antwerp may mention them. Where do we go after this? ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers panel, said a 500-year protection level is too little for a city of this importance, and the importance becomes one of the key features. This is what's going on right now. The Corps of Engineers, by 2011, will restore all of the levees in the area and have a comprehensive hurricane protection system in place against the 100-year flood. Now, the 100-year hurricane event or flood event, as you've just seen, is not seen to be an adequate level of protection. The Corps of Engineers has done some things to try and improve risk communication. They've gone through and with high-level accuracy have computed the elevations of the properties in New Orleans and have indicated this happens to be the pre-Katrina 100-year flood depths. If you had a 100-year flood in Katrina's, before Katrina, and you expect it then to flood to the depth shown here. The darker is talking about 8 feet, and you can see the large percentage of the city of New Orleans that would be under 8 feet of water. Nothing has caused more attention and more people to become concerned about flooding than to see inundation maps like this. They're being prepared for the post-Katrina 100-year and 200-year flood with and without the pump capacities for the internal part of the city. This is the best thing that's been found so far to improve risk communication. At the same time as the Corps of Engineers was working to restore the existing protection, the Senate of the United States, the Congress especially, directed the analysis and design of a project that has protection against the Category 5 hurricane. Now, that's a misnomer because the Category 5 hurricane is not necessarily the worst hurricane from a storm surge basis that can occur. But what they've said is we want to know how we can get a higher level of protection. They asked for a full range of measures to deal with this, and they asked for a preliminary report which was submitted in June of 2006 with the final report by 2007. Unfortunately, that report is still in the process. The state of Louisiana, on the other hand, put together a comprehensive plan in a year, submitted it to the legislature, and has it approved, which starts as a first step to where do we want to go. Within that New Orleans plan, or coastal Louisiana plan by the state, they have indicated that they cannot provide the same level of protection to everybody in the state. New Orleans as an urban community would have a higher level than other areas between here and the coast. The New Orleans Hurricane Protection System is a very unique one. It consists of the levees that we've talked about, but many people do not understand that when Bienville came here, between New Orleans, which you see at the top of this particular map, and the Gulf Coast was a vast wetland area that provided a tremendous storm buffer and barrier against hurricanes. So Bienville, and up until the 60s, people weren't as worried about the hurricanes because the massive wetlands there were certainly providing some flood protection. The problem is New Orleans, or the state of Louisiana, and the area around New Orleans, is losing an enormous amount of wetlands every year, between 25 and 40 square miles per year. That's a lot. And it's retrenching, and you can see it almost looks like a spider web instead of a solid wetland on this chart. So there is another program underway to restore coastal Louisiana's wetlands, protect the massive oil and gas industry along the coast, to take care of the ecosystem which provides for the resources of the coast, the fisheries resources, as well as many other species, protecting the environment. This is something that must be taken into account as we move forward. This is a picture of the plan, and I will tell you the one interesting challenge that comes out of this. You can see the Mississippi running from the top left to the bottom right of this particular chart. Those arrows indicate potential diversions, because what made up the wetlands initially was the stream of sediment that came from the thousands of square miles of the Mississippi Basin down to the Gulf of Mexico. When it hit the Gulf, they spread out along the coastline and formed the delta. And they were continually renewed when you had annual flooding, or when you had major flooding, it was intensified. But unfortunately, levees exist all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and those levees channel the sediment right out into the Gulf of Mexico. And in addition, 50% of the sediment that was coming is trapped behind big dams on the Missouri River. So the state says we've got to figure out a way to take that sediment from the river in the future and spread it on the wetlands to re-nourish them, to build back the wetlands and provide a degree of protection. It will never be as it was in Benville's time, but we can restore the processes that are important to maintain that. The White House report on emergency response, and I'll close with this. What happened in New Orleans, what you saw on the television. The two things that I think the White House said were important is some catastrophes are so important and so large they can only be handled at the federal level. But the second part was the federal, state, and local plans were inadequate. Nobody had ever considered that we could have a catastrophe like that. And that remains the continuing threat in the United States, that people will appreciate what a catastrophe really could be and that it could actually occur. The bottom line, that's New Orleans. Looking at it from across the river, we're right in the middle of that picture. Many people have looked at what happened with Katrina. They've identified the challenges. The challenge now is to see if anybody will do anything about it. Thank you very much.